when I refused to bail with one engine ablaze until we landed, sounded like the kind of line whispered by old airmen in dimly lit mess halls long after the war had ended. But on the afternoon of 19th September 1944, it was not a story, not a legend, and not something imagined in hindsight. It was a living decision unfolding second by second in the cold, smoke-filled air above Arnhem. The sky over the Netherlands was already scarred by war. Dark columns of smoke rising from burning buildings, the ground below fractured by shell fire and movement, and in the middle of it all, a single, unarmed Royal Air Force Douglas C-47 Dakota droned forward at low altitude, steady and exposed, flying exactly the way German anti-aircraft gunners loved their targets to fly. The aircraft belonged to No. 271 Squadron RAF, part of 46 Group, a unit that had been flying non-stop since the beginning of Operation Market Garden, tasked with one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire campaign, resupplying airborne troops trapped behind enemy lines with no guarantee that either the aircraft or their crews would ever return. Inside the cockpit sat Flight Lieutenant David Samuel Anthony Lord, only 24 years old, his hands firm on the controls, his eyes fixed ahead, fully aware that this flight would be different from all the others. Arnhem was not just another drop zone anymore. It was a battlefield surrounded by German armor, infantry, and flak guns, and every aircraft that approached it was flying into a funnel of fire. Just 2 days earlier, on 17th September, more than 35,000 Allied airborne troops had descended into the Netherlands in the largest airborne operation in history. Their mission to seize bridges and open a direct route into Germany itself. At first the plan seemed bold but achievable, the kind of gamble that might end the war before Christmas. Yet by the time Lord's Dakota crossed the Dutch coast on the 19th, the reality on the ground had already turned grim. The British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded, scattered, and desperately short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, and radio contact with many units had collapsed under German pressure. Intelligence failures had placed elements of the ex-SS Panzer Corps directly in their path, including the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, hardened formations equipped with armor, artillery, and experienced crews who were determined to hold Arnhem at all costs. Every hour the airborne troops held out mattered, and every supply drop meant the difference between survival and collapse for isolated platoons defending shattered streets and fields. That knowledge weighed heavily inside the Dakota as it flew on, because this aircraft was carrying more than crates and containers. It was carrying hope. The cargo bay behind the cockpit was filled with ammunition, medical packs, rations, and morphine, all carefully loaded at RAF Down Ampney earlier that day, under a gray English sky that gave no hint of what awaited them across the channel. Ground crews had worked quickly and quietly, fully aware that many of the aircraft they were loading would not come back, and the air crew had gone through their checks with the calm efficiency of men who had already accepted the risks of the mission. Lord himself had volunteered for this sortie, even after losses from previous days had made it clear that resupply flights to Arnhem were among the most dangerous operations flown by the RAF in 1944. Dakotas were slow, large, and unarmed, forced to fly straight and level at low altitude to deliver supplies accurately, which meant they were easy targets for even light anti-aircraft fire, let alone the heavy flak guarding the city. As the formation approached Arnhem, the first black bursts of flak began to appear in the sky, sharp and sudden, each one a reminder that German gunners had the range and the experience to hit them. Tracer fire streaked upward from fields, rooftops, and tree lines, red and white lines cutting through the air toward the transports, and the noise inside the aircraft shifted from the steady hum of engines to a tense mixture of vibration, distant explosions, and shouted call-outs from the crew. At around 1,555 hours, the drop zone came into view, marked by orange panels laid out by British paratroopers under constant fire, smoke drifting across the fields, buildings burning at the edges of the city, and small figures on the ground, waving desperately as they looked up at the approaching aircraft. Lord lined up the Dakota with the precision of a man who had practiced this run many times, adjusting altitude and speed to keep the aircraft steady at less than 900 feet, fully exposed, knowing that every second over the target increased the danger. Then it happened. Without warning, a violent impact shook the entire aircraft as a burst of German flak tore into the starboard engine. The sound was unlike anything else. A deep, tearing roar followed immediately by flames erupting along the engine nacelle, fire streaming backward along the wing, thick black smoke pouring into the slipstream. Inside the cockpit, warning lights flared, instruments flickered, and the sharp smell of burning oil filled the air, forcing the crew to fight the instinct to panic. Fuel pressure dropped rapidly, the engine coughing and surging as it began to fail, and the reality of the situation became instantly clear to everyone on board. A Dakota at low altitude, fully loaded, with one engine on fire over enemy territory, had almost no margin for survival. Standard procedure in such a situation was immediate abandonment, because a burning engine could ignite the wing spar at any moment, tearing the aircraft apart before it ever reached the ground. The call came quickly from inside the aircraft, the words no pilot ever wanted to hear, but expected in moments like this: bail out. Lord heard it, understood it, and ignored it. Ahead of him, the drop zone was still visible, and below him, the airborne troops were still fighting. Still waiting. If he turned away now, the supplies would be lost, scattered or destroyed, and the men on the ground would pay the price for it with their lives. For a brief moment, that decision balanced on the edge between instinct and duty, between self-preservation and responsibility, and then Lord pushed the throttles forward, holding the aircraft on course despite the fire consuming his engine. The Dakota continued straight and level, flying directly through a curtain of flak, each second stretching into something that felt far longer than time should allow. The flames intensified, fed by leaking fuel and oil, and the aircraft shuddered as the damaged engine fought against its own destruction. Inside the fuselage, the temperature rose rapidly, smoke seeping into the cargo bay and cockpit, making it hard to breathe and harder still to think clearly. The navigator called out distance markers, his voice tight but steady, while the dispatcher moved into position at the open cargo doors, bracing himself against the wind and the vibration, hands ready on the release mechanism. German anti-aircraft fire increased as the aircraft remained on its run, gunners adjusting their aim with every second, knowing that a steady target was the easiest kind to kill. By the time the Dakota reached the center of the drop zone, the situation was critical. The starboard engine nearly gone, control surfaces beginning to stiffen, and the fire creeping closer to the wing structure itself. Again, the crew urged Lord to abandon the aircraft, to give the order while there was still time. But again, he refused, holding the Dakota steady with sheer determination and skill. Fear was everywhere inside the aircraft. Fear of fire, fear of impact, fear of death. But it was matched by something stronger. The knowledge that turning away now would mean failure for the men below. Lord kept the aircraft straight, his focus absolute, as the dispatcher released the cargo. One container after another dropping away toward the ground, parachutes snapping open as they fell into the smoke and chaos below. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, all of it delivered exactly where it was needed. And only when the last container was gone did Lord finally begin to turn the aircraft away from the drop zone. But by then, the damage had been done. The burning engine failed completely, the propeller windmilling uselessly, and the Dakota began to lose altitude rapidly, barely clearing buildings and trees as it limped westward away from Arnhem. The fire continued to spread, the wing glowing with heat, and the aircraft shuddered as if it were already breaking apart in the air. Lord knew that the situation could not be held much longer, and at approximately 16:05 hours, he gave the order he had delayed for as long as possible. Bail out. One by one, 5 of the crew jumped from the aircraft, parachutes opening as they fell away from the burning Dakota, leaving Lord and his co-pilot alone in the cockpit. They stayed behind, attempting the impossible, trying to bring a dying aircraft down in some kind of controlled landing rather than letting it crash into the city below. Moments later, the fire reached the wing spar, and the Dakota lost what little control it still had. It descended rapidly toward the ground near the village of WWII, just west of Arnhem, and struck with tremendous force, the impact tearing the aircraft apart in a violent explosion that ended the flight in an instant. Flight Lieutenant David Samuel Anthony Lord was killed instantly at just 24 years of age, his final decision sealed in fire and smoke, his mission completed at the cost of his own life. The men who fell away from the burning Dakota watched in helpless silence as the aircraft that had carried them through flak and fire continued on without them, its wounded shape trailing smoke as it descended toward the countryside west of Arnhem. And even as their parachutes opened and the rush of air slowed their fall, they already knew that Flight Lieutenant David Lord had stayed behind by choice. They hit the ground, scattered across fields and woods, already crawling with German troops, weapons raised, shouts in German cutting through the air as rifles were trained on them almost immediately. There was no escape, no chance to regroup or hide, because the fighting around Arnhem had turned every hedgerow and farmhouse into contested ground, and the sight of parachutes drifting down only drew more attention. One by one, the surviving crewmen were taken prisoner, disarmed, and marched away under guard, their thoughts fixed not on their own fate, but on the burning aircraft they had left behind, and the pilot who had refused to leave it. From where they stood, they could see the column of smoke rising from the crash site near WWII, thick and black against the pale Dutch sky, and the knowledge settled heavily among them that Lord was gone. On the ground at Arnhem, British paratroopers heard the distant explosion and saw the smoke, and for a brief moment, many of them assumed that yet another resupply aircraft had been lost before it could deliver its cargo, a common and bitter sight during those days. But then the supply containers began to appear, parachutes blossoming open as they drifted down into the perimeter, landing among shell holes and ruined streets, and hands reached out to grab them even as bullets cracked nearby. Ammunition was distributed almost immediately. Magazines passed from man to man, weapons reloaded, and for units that had been down to their last rounds, the difference was immediate and profound. Medics tore open supply packs to find morphine and bandages, treating wounded men who had been lying for hours with little more than field dressings and hope, while ration packs were shared among exhausted soldiers who had not eaten properly since the drop. No one on the ground knew the full story of how those supplies had arrived, only that a Dakota had flown straight into hell to deliver them. And that knowledge alone strengthened morale in a situation where morale was often the only thing keeping men in their positions. As the hours passed and the fighting continued, the airborne perimeter around Arnhem grew smaller, German pressure increasing from all sides as armor, infantry, and artillery closed in. Radio contact with higher command remained unreliable, and the reality slowly became unavoidable that relief forces were not going to arrive in time. Yet the supplies delivered that afternoon allowed isolated pockets of resistance to hold on longer, to evacuate wounded who would otherwise have been left behind, and to inflict further losses on the attacking German units. And in that sense, the flight of Lord's Dakota echoed through the battle long after the aircraft itself had been destroyed. In captivity, Lord's surviving crewmen were questioned repeatedly by their German captors, who were keenly interested in the behavior of Allied aircrews and the tactics used during resupply operations. But the men spoke little beyond what was required, their minds returning again and again to the moments inside the aircraft when the order to bail out had been given and refused. Each of them had understood the danger, had known the odds, and had felt the same fear when the engine erupted in flames. Yet what stayed with them was the calm in Lord's voice and the steadiness of his actions, the way he had flown the aircraft as if discipline alone might hold it together. After the war, when they were finally free to speak openly, their accounts would form the foundation of the story that spread through RAF circles. A story not exaggerated by bravado or myth, but grounded in the simple facts of what had happened over Arnhem. Word reached Britain through official channels as reports from Operation Market Garden were compiled and losses assessed. And among those reports was the account of a Dakota pilot who had continued a supply run with one engine ablaze, refused repeated orders to abandon the aircraft, and only gave the order to bail out after the mission was complete. In the winter of 1944, as the war in Europe dragged on and new battles consumed attention, that account found its way to senior RAF commanders, and from there into the formal process that evaluated acts of gallantry. The citation that would later be written did not embellish the facts, because the facts themselves were enough, describing how Flight Lieutenant David Samuel Anthony Lord had shown supreme gallantry and devotion to duty, how he had flown straight and level through intense anti-aircraft fire while his aircraft was on fire, and how his actions had ensured the successful delivery of vital supplies to airborne troops in desperate need. In January 1945, with the war still raging, Lord was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for bravery in the British Commonwealth, and the announcement carried a weight that went beyond the words on the page. For those